A global hub of commerce, culture, and opportunity, New York City has attracted Muslims from all over the world. New York is also a place of unique challenges, with its skyscraping cost of living and its status as the capital of capitalism. I've come here to discover what it's like to be a Muslim in New York City. Altogether, there are about 200 masajid in New York City and almost 1 million Muslims. This accounts for nearly a quarter of all the Muslims in the United States as a whole. New York City is made up of 5 distinct boroughs. Of these 5, Brooklyn is the most populous one, being home for over 2.5 million New Yorkers. A strong and deep-rooted Muslim community has thrived here for generations. However, Brooklyn is changing rapidly due to gentrification, a challenge that is affecting many communities here. Asad Dandia is a community organizer and a proud native Brooklynite. We met in Bay Ridge, a predominantly Arab neighborhood in southwest Brooklyn.
I think Brooklyn has a distinct character to it that I think makes it stand out from the other boroughs. Right, it has three iconic bridges connecting it to Manhattan: the Manhattan Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, and of course the Brooklyn Bridge. That proximity lends it some more credibility, but it has its own distinct character to it that I think makes it stand out from the others.
And Brooklyn used to be a city by itself, right?
Correct. Brooklyn was a city of its own until the great merger into what became known as Greater New York in 1898. And Brooklyn used to compete directly with Manhattan and Chicago. So it was really able to hold up its own weight in ways that the other boroughs could not, because they were mostly just farmland. But Brooklyn was really its own metropolis in its own right. Bay Ridge is a neighborhood in southern Brooklyn, right by, you could say, right by the Verrazano Bridge. The neighborhood is very much known for its Arab American community. You can call it Little Palestine, if you'd like, because of its significant Palestinian population. Right, one of the largest Palestinian diasporas here in the U.S. lives in Bay Ridge.
We sat down to eat at Ayat, a popular family-run Palestinian restaurant in Bay Ridge.
When I was an 18 or 19-year-old undergraduate student, roughly a decade ago, I had co-founded a charity. And that charity was infiltrated by the New York City Police Department. I'll give you the long story short. One of our volunteers confessed to being a police informant, publicly confessed on the Facebook post to being a police informant. He was around my age, South Asian background, Muslim background, and he was an informant spying on me and my friends. And shortly thereafter, I got involved in what's called a class action lawsuit to sue the police. And so that's what we did. We got involved in a class action lawsuit against NYPD surveillance of Muslim communities in 2013. That lawsuit lasted several years, 3 or 4 years, I want to say. And so basically my early to mid-20s was spent entirely in battling police and police surveillance.
Bismillah. The lamb is so soft and tender, the yogurt sauce makes it all come together, and the almonds on top is a perfect touch. Asad is also an urban studies graduate, and he has strong views on the value of dense cities.
So make a case for being a Muslim in an urban environment.
There are so many angles you can start with, right? You can start with the fact that it's much more environmentally sustainable to live in the city than in the suburbs. Particularly New York City, which is dense. New York City's unparalleled density makes it such that energy, land, water, all of these things which we are arguably commanded, right, to conserve and to take care of as khulafa, as stewards on the earth, right? These things are much better conserved here due to the density of the city. City life is where real community is made, where you know the people who live next to you, right? Where you can actually embody the hadith that you're not really a true believer unless you know that the 40 homes around you are well fed, right? I'm paraphrasing, right? So don't take me as an exact quote, but 40 homes, well, that's one apartment building in the city, right? And you can get to know all of your neighbors in the apartment building and feed them and embody that hadith, right? There are masjids every 15 minutes here, walking wise, right? From any point in town. 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and that population is growing. If we want a sustainable future, we have to look towards cities and building and infrastructure. We can learn a lot from cities in the global south too. You look at places like Cairo, Karachi, Tehran. They're very, very dense, very large cities. All three of these cities have more people in them than New York City. Maybe with the exception of Tehran, which I think is just slightly more. But Cairo and Karachi have almost double, or more than double, New York City's population. Right? Amidst the turmoil and the deprivation and the economic disinvestment, these cities are managing quite well in terms of having dense housing, right? Having people live within close proximity of one another, coming up with creative solutions to the climate crisis.
And these cities that you mentioned are Muslim cities.
Muslim cities, yeah.
An interesting thing is that a lot of Muslims in America now are growing up in suburbs, like me. And we think that that's like the normal way, up to a point where we realize that most of the Muslim world, people live in dense cities, like New York.
Yeah, New York City is not that different from a place like Karachi or Cairo, right? Like, these are all cities where people come into contact with one another and engage with one another and learn from one another, so on and so forth.
I think when you're young and you have energy, you need to go to a city and use that energy for good, for building something, for achieving something. Without being in such an environment, it's very easy to just settle into a comfortable life where you don't push yourself and you don't make any risks. How big of a problem is gentrification in Brooklyn today?
Right, thanks to rent stabilization, my family's able to stay in Brooklyn. We haven't been displaced or driven out. Like Williamsburg, for example, a very large Puerto Rican community used to live in Williamsburg.
Wow.
That community has shrunk significantly. Did you even know that? Most people don't know that, right?
Yeah.
It's still there, but it has shrunk significantly. Bed-Stuy, probably the most iconic black neighborhood in the country after Harlem, being gentrified.
Yeah.
Black people moving out, Black Lives Matter signs moving in, as they say, right? It's tragic.
I took the subway over to Bed-Stuy, an iconic Brooklyn neighborhood on the northern end of Brooklyn, closer to Manhattan. Gareth Bryant, a Bed-Stuy native and a local chaplain, says he sees gentrification transforming his neighborhood by the day. So we're on Bedford Avenue. This area is called Bed-Stuy, right?
Yeah, Bed-Stuy, yeah.
So what was it like growing up here?
It was very rough. It was very crime-ridden, drug-ridden. There was a lot of narcotics, a lot of prostitution. No Starbucks. But what's funny is like in Bed-Stuy, just in New York City in general, but specifically like in like certain parts of like very historically known crime-ridden areas, it's easier to find a Starbucks than it is a trap house now. And that's for better or for worse, because the thing about the gentrification, that's basically just the real estate version of colonization. You know what I'm saying? So all of these realtors, they're really like Christopher Columbus with properties to sell. You know what I'm saying? So Bed-Stuy has been a particular target and focus for gentrification.
Why is that?
Because when this particular part of New York City, this particular part of Brooklyn, because it has such a stark and dark history of criminality, the property values like plummeted. All of these buildings you see, this building that used to be here, this never used to be. It's a very brand new building. Like it's not even finished yet.
Yeah.
This building over here where it says available, all of these properties on this block, and just like any other block, during the crack era in the 1980s, this particular piece of Bed-Stuy was like a hornet's nest during the crack era. And by Allah's mercy, the Muslim Afro-Americans and the Muslim Latinos in these types of neighborhoods, they were able to force out a great percentage of drug trafficking in these neighborhoods.
It all started when a Palestinian man came to Imam Siraj Wahaj, who was the imam here at Masjid al-Taqwa.
He said, Imam, I got a problem. We have a building and some drug dealers took it over. One of our apartments took it over. And I went to the cops. The cops did nothing. He was crying. I went with him. About 7 of us was in front of the door. I knocked on the door. They said, who is it? I said, it's the Muslims, and we're here to take back the apartment of our brother. One of them said, the leader, to the people there, hey man, it's the Muslims, don't do nothing stupid. He opened the door, and I said, you gotta go. I said, okay.
They went on to clear over a dozen crack houses in the neighborhood. Gareth, however, says they didn't do enough.
Unfortunately, these Muslim communities early on, they were very short-sighted in terms of the acquisition of property ownership and business ownership.
What do you think what the neighborhood would look like if the Muslims had that longer sight?
If they had that basira, if they had that vision, you would probably own at least 70% of the property within a 2 or 3 block radius. If they had that type of vision, if they had that type of foresight to really go get it.
And in America, if you own the real estate, you have the power to shape the neighborhood.
Yeah. In Jewish neighborhoods, they dictate neighborhood policy. People don't want to recognize and accept this, but it's reality. There's certain apartment buildings that if you're not Jewish, they're not going to advertise towards you. That's just a fact. You would have to really struggle and just be a go-getter to move into an apartment or get a house in a neighborhood that's predominantly a Jewish area. Certain parts of Williamsburg, certain parts of Borough Park, Kew Gardens. They really give people a hard way to go who are non-Jewish to move in and entrench themselves in those neighborhoods. And the reason how and why they're able to move that way is because they're property owners and they're business owners. These used to be lots. These used to be vacant lots and everything. Muslims could have and should have bought these properties, and these properties in the 80s were pennies on a dollar. And again, going back to what I mentioned, is that Muslim Afro-Americans, sadly, pitifully, we really dropped the ball.
We picked up some fresh baked goods from Abu's Bean Pies. Bismillah. Super creamy, smooth, a lot of cinnamon flavor. Crust is very soft and tender, and then the edge is a little crispy, so you get both textures. It's really good. New York's Muslim population has grown a lot over the years, bringing immigrants from all over the world. Unfortunately, cultural biases have caused some of them to mistreat their brothers and sisters that were here in the first place.
Just because someone is the same skin complexion as you doesn't mean that they won't discriminate against you, right? Mm-hmm. For example, the average Arab during the lifetime of Muhammad, peace be upon him, they were dark-skinned people. This is just a historically known fact. Yeah. Yet they discriminated against non-Arabs who were just as dark as they were. I know Muslims from many different parts of the world. They're just as dark as this chair, and they'll call you a nigga in a heartbeat. And their skin is literally darker than mine, and they'll call you black with a condescending tone. It happens all the time. You know what I'm saying? The common phrase in Urdu, kala, kallu, right? Which means black, right? But it is used very deliberately, culturally, in a negative context. With Arabs the same way, with many different types of people the same way. People who are from certain parts of Africa, same way, you know? Yeah. For example, people from Sudan, right? The word Sudan literally means the land of black people. But you have people who are Sudanese, they'll come to places and they'll be discriminatory against Afro-Americans. And they literally come from a country that literally means land of black people in Arabic. Again, going back to what Muhammad, peace be upon him, mentioned, he said there's 4 manifestations of ignorance that his nation will never abandon. And literally 2 out of those 4 things directly deal with xenophobia directly. Those who boast of their own genealogies and those who discredit other people because of their genealogies. And literally we live what Muhammad, peace upon him, mentioned. We live what he prophesied. And you know, a lot of Muslims, they try to mask under this statement, quote unquote, there's no racism in Islam. In spite of the fact that that's a true statement, the average Muslim who says that, they only say that as a cover to try to pretend that no Muslim commits al-asabiyya, xenophobia. And that's completely false. Anytime the subject of al-asabiyya is confronted or addressed amongst or between Muslims, and they yell out, oh, well, what about Bilal? That's how you know how xenophobic they are. Because Arabs, they're so xenophobic, they don't even claim Bilal ibn Rabah, may Allah be pleased with him, in spite of the fact that he was Arab. Al-Dhahabi and others like them, like Ibn Jawzi, As-Suyuti, Al-Tabari, many others, Ibn Sa'd. And they make it very clear, and they say in their writings, Laysa Bilal Habashiyan. They say it literally in their writings, Bilal was not Abyssinian. His father was from one of the family clans of Quraysh known as Bani Jumah. A lot of people who had family histories of al-ubuda, slavery in pagan Arab society prior to the revelation of the Quran, a lot of them, their genealogies were lost. People knew they were Arab, but a lot of times their genealogies were lost.
I see.
And then oftentimes what pagan Arabs would do is that if a person was an Arab via their fathers, but if they had non-Arab mothers, especially if they had non-Arab mothers who came from people who the Arabs had beef with, they would automatically impose the genealogy of the mother upon the slave.
I see.
You know what I'm saying? That was a very common practice among pagan Arabs. And, you know, ironically, white supremacy is based on that a lot. Like, for example, the concubine of Thomas Jefferson, Salee Hemings. That person was actually Thomas Jefferson's sister-in-law, because his concubine, Salee Hemings, and his wife, Martha Wiles, they had the same father. Their father was John Wiles, a European slave owner.
Wow.
Even the famous hadith that's in Al-Bukhari, in which Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, may Allah be pleased with him, how they disrespected one of the companions, right?
Yeah.
First of all, the name Bilal doesn't even show up in those narrations. That's number one. So there's no historical proof that Abu Dhar al-Ghifari was even speaking about Bilal ibn Rabah. That's number one. Number two, even Abu Dhar al-Ghifari themselves is described by Muslim biographers as Rajulun Aswad, black man relative to his dark skin. I mean, even the Prophet ﷺ, if Muhammad, peace on him, were alive right now, we would probably be the same skin complexion. But when you say things like that, people like, oh my God, it's like people want to have heart attacks. You know what I'm saying? So it shows you what people have in their minds and hearts, like the hatred, the disdain that people have against other people.
In far southern Brooklyn, the brownstones and corner stores give way to sandy beaches and clear skies. Brighton Beach, a sleepy Russian neighborhood, and Coney Island, known for its iconic theme park. I dug into some little-known Muslim history in the area that predates the name New York itself. Today, Coney Island is known as a family favorite for spending a weekend at the beach. But back in 1643, this was actually a Dutch settlement, and it was mostly farmland. That was when a very interesting man by the name of Anthony von Salee used to live here, and he might be one of the first Muslims on record to live in the Western Hemisphere. This bill of sale, held by the Brooklyn Historical Society, verifies that Anthony purchased 200 acres of land in Coney Island. Anthony was known to be a practicing Muslim, and his contemporaries called him Anthony the Turk, in a derogatory way to refer to his religion. He was also known to have been always reading his Quran, and that copy that he owned was actually sold in 1886 to a collector in the United States. Anthony was a son of the infamous Dutch pirate Jan Janzoen, also known by the Ottomans as Murat Reis the Younger. Jan Janzoen converted to Islam after being abducted by North African pirates. Some say that he was forced to become Muslim, but it's clear by the way that he passed his faith down to his son Anthony to be practiced here in the New World that Jan was a sincere Muslim. The threat of gentrification is causing Muslim Brooklynites to seek housing elsewhere, dismantling long-standing communities and erasing their histories. It's up to local Brooklynites, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, to get involved locally and preserve their communities.